Good evening and welcome to our event, Free Speech on Campus. I am Terry Rhodes, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's event is sponsored by the UNC Program for Public Discourse and the Institute of Politics. The Program for Public Discourse seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation, enabling them to be better democratic citizens and leaders. Tonight's event will showcase the program's ability to foster lively debate and demonstrate why dialogue is essential to the mission of our university. The event is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics, a student organization here at UNC, aiming to inspire our students to pursue careers in public service. We all hope this event will be part of an ongoing conversation about how to foster free expression on campus and beyond. The right of free speech is one of the most cherished tenets of the U.S. Constitution. At Carolina, we embrace this right and strive to foster a campus culture where students and faculty feel comfortable talking openly about controversial topics and have opportunities to consider opposing perspectives. As one of the 16 North Carolina universities that are a part of the UNC system, we also uphold the North Carolina Restore and Preserve Free Speech Act, enacted in 2017, and the UNC System Board of Governors policy on free speech and free expression. We are also proud of the green light rating on protecting speech that UNC Chapel Hill has received from FIRE, which stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Our guests will be speaking more about that during their talk. It is fitting that this event falls during University Research Week, which is an annual celebration of UNC's research excellence. Innovative research requires open dialogue. Moreover, 3 of our faculty members recently shared the results of a survey examining undergraduate perspectives on free expression and constructive dialogue at Carolina. Our panelists will be discussing this survey later in the program. All 3 of our panelists are experts on free speech issues on campus. Professor Sigal Ben-Porath teaches in the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education and has recently published a book describing how campuses can promote what she refers to as inclusive freedom. Greg Lukianoff, an attorney by training, is president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, The Coddling of the American Mind. Dr. Jacqueline Pfeffer Merrill taught political philosophy for many years at several colleges, including St. John's and William & Mary. She is currently the director of the Campus Free Expression Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Our discussion will be moderated by UNC's own Kevin Marinelli. Professor Marinelli teaches in the Department of Communication and is the executive director of the Program for Public Discourse here at Carolina. I think you will find this evening's discussion insightful and engaging. I look forward to hearing our panelists' perspectives on how to encourage the free exchange of ideas within our campus community. Thank you for joining us. Now, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you, Dean Rhodes. Welcome, panelists, and welcome viewers watching at home. I'm Kevin Marinelli. I'll be moderating the discussion tonight, but we certainly welcome your questions as well. So feel free to contribute a question using the Q&A tool at any time, and we'll begin answering audience questions at around 6:30. In the meantime, you might see some links pop up in the chat. Feel free to utilize them or feel free to ignore them if you like. At the very end of the discussion, we will have a quick 2-question survey pop up. The answers are optional, but we certainly welcome and value your feedback. And also, if you have to leave for any moment, we want to let you know that a recording of our discussion tonight will become available on our YouTube page in the next few days, and there will be a link to that at the end of our discussion. So, the title of our discussion tonight is Free Speech on Campus, which has become something of a ubiquitous phrase in recent years, but I'm guessing it means something different to different people. So to help anchor our discussion tonight, I'd like each of you to explain what this phrase means to you in your own words. Jackie, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Well, Kevin, thanks very much for that introduction. And I want to thank also Dean Rhodes and the Program for Public Discourse and the Institute of Politics for the opportunity to be here this evening. Free speech and more broadly, free expression is something to which schools like UNC and all the schools in that are public colleges and universities have both an institutional mission-driven obligation to and a legal obligation to. A pluralistic democratic society such as ours requires in our politics and civic life wide open debate and to let citizens live according to what their vision of the good life is. And for that, we have the First Amendment protections that are really crucial. A university has a more specific good that it pursues. Its twin missions of the pursuit of knowledge and teaching students. And that also requires robust, open conversation and debate and discourse. And I'm looking forward to a conversation about how we really cultivate on that. I wouldn't pick the First Amendment for myself as a top line statement about how to do that. The First Amendment protects all but the worst speech. It usually protects plagiarism, which we want not to allow at colleges and universities. It often protects provocateurs who don't really want to advance academic discussion. So there's a lot more to free expression on a campus than just First Amendment protections.
Okay, thank you. Sigal?
Thank you, Kevin, and I echo Jackie's, gratitude for the opportunity to be here, and of course, sharing the stage with you, Jackie and Greg. I agree with what Jackie was saying here. I think for universities and colleges, beyond their legal commitments to, of course, abiding by constitutional and any other legal expectations related to the protection of open expression or free speech, universities and colleges have, of course, academic freedom as an additional layer of the protection of open expression, which really is aimed at making sure that people participating in these pursuits that Jackie mentioned, the pursuit of research or knowledge and the pursuit of teaching and learning, that they are able to do so without concern for reprimand or losing their jobs or otherwise being censored or concerned about their security. So academic freedom as an additional dimension of the legal, on top of the legal protections, really supports campus free speech through making sure that people can pursue research even if it's unpopular and also express their opinions as citizens, specifically faculty, but also students. We will talk about challenges to this goal later, but aspirationally, campus free speech means that people can do on campus what they came to do: pursue research, pursue teaching and learning in a free way and without concern.
Okay, thank you. Greg?
Muted myself. Sorry, I think I just remuted myself. When it comes to free speech on campus, that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. And one thing that I am thankful for, for first generation American, my dad escaped totalitarianism, is that Americans are lucky enough to confuse the First Amendment and freedom of speech. We use them interchangeably. were wrong, but it's actually a credit to the First Amendment that Americans can actually get those two confused. That's not actually the case in an awful lot of other countries. But what I always say is freedom of speech is a older, bolder, broader idea, and it's almost as simple as the term itself: the ability to actually, express your point of view without fear of being punished, without, and even farther than that. The real value of free speech comes from when people don't just tolerate the people they disagree with, but actually sometimes listen to them, and here's even more radical, because they might be right. And I could, all of us here could go on forever about what free speech means and our thinking on it. But my thinking, I just want to emphasize one way of looking at it that is a little idiosyncratic to my thinking. I'm not a big fan of the marketplace of ideas metaphor. It's useful, but it's a very small part of what free speech is for, in my opinion. Free speech is about knowing the world as it actually is. It's a very humanist perspective that I have on this stuff. But basically, at the bottom of my thinking about freedom of speech, it's that it's always important to know what people really think and why, full stop. And that's from a scientific standpoint. That's definitely from a political standpoint. I think we ignore things, beliefs that we don't like, at our peril. But we are the most important, to a degree. Human beings are the most important things for us to study, and that's a big part of the role of higher education. It is to engage in the audacious project of human knowledge, and at minimum, we have to know how we tick and what we really think. Always.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like for all of you, the First Amendment is a part of the answer, but free speech is not reduced or even the most important component of free speech, and particularly free speech on campus, where academic freedom is so important. And I think it's a great transition to my next question. When we think about free speech on campus, the University of Chicago has certainly stood as a perennial leader in that discussion. And of course, it made headlines in 2014 when its president, Robert Zimmer, made its now famous, perhaps infamous, comments to incoming first-year students about the purpose of college: to make you think and not to make you feel comfortable, which ultimately culminated in the Chicago Principles of Free Speech in 2015, which many institutions have since endorsed, including the University of North Carolina. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about the Chicago Principles, if you think it gets it right, if you think it misses the mark in places, doesn't go far enough. And Sigal, I'll begin with you here because I know you've written about this issue in the past. Are you muted? Oh, I think
Right,
there we
sorry,
go.
that was not even my fault. So thank you for this, Kevin. And if our opening statements presented a risk of raging agreement among us, I think this question will get us very quickly past this concern. I think the Chicago statement gets the whole field wrong. And I'm saying it with the greatest respect for and collegiality with the people who drafted it, and with Jeffrey Stone, who was one of the main people writing it, and who I have just hosted as a speaker in a similar event to this. So this is not on a personal level, but really at the level of how I understand campus free speech and what really protects it. What does the Chicago statement get wrong? First of all, I think, I will just say two things because I have like 15, but I don't want to hog the microphone for too long. First of all, I think the Chicago statement is wrong in prioritizing expression in a way that is nominally neutral to the position and the power differential of the speakers. And by presenting its neutrality to power relations, it really is in itself sustaining these differences, particularly in a society as unequal as ours. And therefore, it allows for the protected expression on campus to sustain and even enhance these power inequities. And we see that very regularly when the statements such as the Chicago Statement or similar ones are or even claims related to the First Amendment are used to protect and maintain the opportunity of people in power to degrade, silence, and otherwise undermine the opportunity of others, particularly others who are coming from less power groups that are historically marginalized, whether it's going to be racial minorities, gender or sexual minorities, religious minorities, women in engineering or philosophy, that's my field. So wherever it might be, right? So first of all, the neutrality doesn't work. You have to consider what the protections are used for. And the other thing, which I'll say just really quickly, that the Chicago Statement gets wrong, and it's not in itself, it's in its use. It's misguided to try and take a statement like this, which is like just a brief declaration of a commitment to open expression, is a couple pages. I mean, it's really short. And to try to use that in a cut and paste sort of way across all institutions. The protection of free speech at UNC is different than at Penn, because a UNC is a public institution and Penn is private. And then again, it's gonna be different at a historically Black college or at a women's college. So of course we need to have a commitment to open expression, but this kind of statement flattens the differences across institutions and really doesn't allow us to engage as an institution in the students that we serve and in our histories and in other unique dimensions of open expressions that require attention on our campuses. I stop here.
Okay, thank you. Jackie or Greg, I'll let you pick up on that.
I mean, I'm happy to. I just completely disagree. I think the Chicago Statement is a much needed addition to existing free speech statements going back to the 1915 American Association of University professor statement. Now, what you've heard is an expression that has largely come out of American academia in the 1970s and 80s that basically makes an argument for power having more power over speech and opinion in the name of the powerless. This is, to me, misunderstanding the role of free speech in general, and it's also a lack of honesty on the part of academia and higher education on how much power they wield. Now, and this has actually led to a disaster for free speech globally. That essentially, you only need free speech in a democracy to protect minority points of view, because 51% protects power. And of course, money and influence is pretty much protected in every society, money except communism. But it exists to promote minority points of view. However, higher education has become so monolithic, so homogenous in terms of its opinion, it has actually gotten, but it won't admit that it is actually power itself, that it actually kids itself into thinking, well, we're not really in power, we're not really the powerful, and therefore I think I should have more power to police speech because I'm fixing things. See, that's always what power thinks. Power always thinks it's doing something good. So I think that and partially because this inability to admit higher education is power itself. It is actually teaching the rest of the world that really free speech is about maintaining power relationships, which is complete nonsense. Free speech feels like a threat to higher education because they are power.
Jackie?
Sure. Well, I think I'm going to take a more intermediate position. I do think that the Chicago statement and ones like it have had a tremendous importance as the occasion for campuses to have real conversations about what is the place of free expression on our particular campus. And I think, Sigal made a difference between the statement itself and how it's been used. The Chicago statement itself starts with quoting Presidents Harper and Presidents Gray and others, and situates it in Chicago's own history. And I think we've seen on other campuses, Gettysburg, Maryland, Colgate, real difficult campus conversations about the value of free expression on their campuses that have resulted in really fruitful conversations and culminated in statements that have been the basis for rewriting other policies and set metrics for really measuring the quality and extent of free expression on campus. So I do think they can have real value, especially when they're rooted in a campus mission and history. One thing that I do like about the Chicago statement, that it just needs to be so unpacked. And I printed it out in advance. I'm going to quote it exactly. Fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission. That's I think, so important. And it means that we are assuming that 18-year-olds or however old one is when one arrives on campus, the 18 to 22-year-old student isn't the typical student anymore. But you're not fully prepared for all kinds of reasons that I know Greg has a lot to say about, for the rough and tumble of campus debate. And it's part of the business of the university to make sure that you really learn to have conversations across difference, to work collaboratively with those with whom you have principal disagreements, and learn about the wide range of views in our politics over the course of your collegiate career.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps I don't want to move away too quickly because this is such an interesting discussion. Perhaps we could have time for a rejoinder. So Sigal, would you like to get back in there after listening to Greg and Jackie?
How could you tell? Yes, for sure. Well, so here it is. I mean, my sense is that, of course, open expression and statements like Chicago's are required in order to protect minority opinions, right? Clearly, this is what the protection of open expression is for. If I can take it myself, I don't need you to give it to me, right? Or I don't need the law to protect me against infringement on my rights. However, particularly on a college campus, when you look at a classroom, right? So I spent 4 years chairing the Committee on Open Expression at Penn, where I really had to go more deeply into issues that are not simply legal matters, right? So it's not, if it was just a legal matter, it would be a matter for general counsel, right? It wouldn't be a matter for the Committee on Open Expression. Really trying to understand, why are some students complaining about a particular professor saying something that they find offensive? Was it a one-off? Is there a relational problem? Is the professor somehow undermining the opportunity for certain students repeatedly to participate and to make use of their learning environment? And sometimes there are one-offs, but so commonly there are relational power relations and relational difficulties that create the conditions whereby my view, which may be not a minority view in the way that Greg was describing it, actually is silenced for whatever, either identity or political or various reasons, right? So it doesn't have to be only just because, let's say, I'm a woman or I'm Jewish or I'm an immigrant, all of which describe me, or can be different things for different people, right? Their color of their skin or other ways in which their views can be undermined. Maybe they have a minority political view that causes them to be silenced in some classrooms, as we are seeing as well. So the issue is not so much whether these people are members of minority groups. The issue is whether they can really speak freely in this college classroom. And what I worry about the Chicago statement is that it papers over this, right? In cases like Jackie was describing, and I was a part, and continue to be a part of processes like this across many college campuses, where the discussion about the Chicago statement, whether it's being endorsed after all as in Colgate, or whether a different thing is being developed as in Williams or Middlebury. And there are, of course, a lot of, so I'm just offering similar ones, right? But this is happening in many places. The issue really is, are we having a conversation about the real concerns that are bothering our student body and our faculties? And are we able to develop policies and especially practices that will help us overcome that? If we're just signing off on the Chicago statement and we feel like we did our jobs and we can be satisfied, that's a concern to me. By the way, similar to getting a green light on fires rating, right? So, and I think Greg would agree with that. I'm not saying that as a thing at all, right? I think the campus needs to continue to respond to the people it serves and to its members beyond such declaratory statements. Okay, I'll get off my high horse now and I'll mute myself there.
Well, thank you. And I don't want to restrict anyone in any way, so please feel free to engage or ask each other questions as well. You don't have to go through me, but Greg, I'll let you get in there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that the Chicago statement by itself isn't enough. And, if you look at the bones of the Chicago statement, it's addressing a lot of the academic freedom issues that were present in 2014. Disinvitations, shouting people down, universities shouldn't be tolerating. I mean, you can argue against disinvitation. Students have a right to say someone shouldn't be invited. That's fine. But shout downs, no, that goes against the spirit of what a university's supposed to be. But do I think it's sufficient? Oh, absolutely not. I think it's a plus if universities pass it. I think and when a university can't pass it, I get a little concerned. And just like with the green light ratings that we have at FIRE, it's good. It's much better to have good policies on the book than bad. But one thing that we are heading into right now, where I finally, as you can know, I write books about psychology, kind of like I have interest, kind of like if you read my blog, I'm kind of all over the place. But we've been asked for 20 years to do rankings of schools for free speech, and I was never willing to do it because I think it's just too rigorous. It requires too many dimensions. And we took a stab at it this year because we finally had the opportunity to do panels of individual students on particular campuses. UNC actually didn't do as well as I would have expected. I tend to think of you guys as being very good on free speech every time I've spoken there, but there's some inhibition going on there. But I do think we're finally reaching the stage where we can have a multi-factor analysis of basically saying they have good policies, they passed Chicago statement, they've protected students' rights, they do orientation. There's a way actually now to do it that I hadn't previously seen in my career, where I think we could really say, listen, if you want free speech, go to these schools. If you don't, if there are other values that are more important to you, if there's a different telos, as John Haidt likes to say, you might want to consider these other ones. And I think that ranking could actually potentially be very, very helpful.
I have a follow-up to that, but before we go there, I want to give Jackie a chance to get her second comment in.
I'd rather just go into the next question. We've got so many topics here today. Thank you.
Great. All right. So, Greg, that's a good opportunity to transition to your group, FIRE, which we've kind of intimated a little bit, but haven't really discussed in depth. So I was hoping you could tell the viewers more about your organization and specifically the criteria that you use to evaluate institutions' commitment to free speech.
I joined FIRE in 2001. I actually landed to find my apartment for FIRE at 9:10 a.m. on 9/11. I was one of the last planes to land, and I didn't know what had happened. FIRE was only about a year and a half old at that point. So we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. And we were founded by a left-leaning, we had a left-leaning founder and a right-leaning founder, but they were friends, and they wanted to have an organization that really was nonpartisan and would defend free speech, due process, and academic freedom. And I got to tell you, I've been doing it for 20 years, and it's not dull. And I was someone who went to law school and specifically specialized in First Amendment. This is what I wanted to do. It's partially because my father is, Russian by way of Yugoslavia. My mother's Irish by way of Britain. And growing up in an actual multicultural environment, I realized that no two parents could actually agree on what speech should be protected and shouldn't be, that there were just completely different norms. So in that situation, I think free speech, it makes a lot of sense. So what does FIRE do? How do we rank schools? What we were limited to for a very long time, and I think it's important, but insufficient, as I mentioned before, was evaluating pretty much every policy that we could find, at least, of a university's code to see if it stands up to First Amendment muster. Now, our standards overall are that we appreciate freedom of association. So if you want to tell people at my school you don't really get free speech, you actually have the freedom of association to start up that school. We call those kind of schools warning schools. It's basically saying, listen, you can go to the school if you want to, but they're not promising you much or anything in the way of free speech. Public schools are bound by the First Amendment through the 14th Amendment. It's a little complicated, but basically they have to protect free speech and academic freedom of both students and faculty. Private schools are bound by their promises, and overwhelmingly, and actually there's one wrinkle there, private schools in California are actually bound by the law. So my alma mater, Stanford, actually is required to follow First Amendment standards. Private schools are bound by their promises, and there's different jurisdictions that give this different levels of strength, that give the contractual promises different levels of strength. But our overall thing is that if you come to a school that has glowing promises of freedom of speech, it should be at least as free as the community college down the road. So we take all of these things into evaluation, but like I said, we've never had a tool before that lets us individually look into what students are really saying about how free they are to talk about different issues.
Perhaps it would help to take a step back for our viewers to let them know what exactly does that mean when we say a public institution is bound by the First Amendment to protect free speech. What exactly legally does that mean? Does that mean anyone could just go on campus and say whatever they want at whatever time they want?
If it's okay if I answer this one. This is something I end up having to explain every time I speak in other countries, is that people think our First Amendment is just completely nuts. And when I go there partially to explain it, that a lot of the things that people think are protected speech in the US aren't. Threats aren't protected, intimidation isn't protected. There are limitations on how much you can show in terms of erotic material. I actually think the US law is too restrictive on that, but that's another story. Libel is not protected. Disrupting people's events is not protected. Harassment isn't protected speech, for example. So it's not this absolute free-for-all that people sometimes think. And I break a very big rule of decorum when it comes to constitutional lawyers. When I go to other countries, I say, listen, I actually think our body of law, the First Amendment body of law, is some of the best thought out philosophy on how you have free speech in the real world, and that there's a lot that people can learn about it. And I definitely think it's superior to things to ideas like the right to be forgotten, for example, or the state secrets laws that dominate a lot of these countries that we think of as otherwise free, for example.
Thank you. So Sigal, you've demonstrated a sharp difference of opinion with Greg, and I think that would be a good opportunity to tell the audience about your concept of inclusive freedom that you address in your book by the same title of our talk tonight, Free Speech on Campus.
Thank you. Yeah, so inclusive freedom, which is a concept that I develop in the book and that I continue working on both as a matter of practice and as a conceptual issue. Inclusive freedom really is a framework that is meant to organize an understanding of campus free speech beyond the legal framework that Greg was just now sort of like sketching for us. So inclusive freedom basically takes seriously the importance of a free and open exchange of ideas, first of all, as a necessary condition for the pursuit of knowledge, whether the pursuit of knowledge is through research or through teaching and learning. It also takes freedom, the open exchange of ideas as a contributing conditions to the development of civic and democratic capacities, which Jackie was mentioning before, and are another important part of the mission of higher education institutions. Expressing views, trying new ideas, exchanging perspectives, developing your values and your visions. Those are all necessary for research and for learning. Therefore, open expression, as we just heard from Greg, is at the heart of our work. At the same time, inclusive freedom lends a similar weight to the related demand that all members of the university community be able to have their voice heard and be able to be considered as a free and equal members of the campus community. So the inclusive part, right, the inclusion part is basically meant to try and neutralize or limit the impact of the differences in power that I mentioned before, and to try to equalize the burden that the protection of free speech places on some individuals more than on others, right? So some members of the campus community are really burdened more than others by the fact that we are protecting speech that can be discriminatory or that can express bias or prejudice towards certain groups. And therefore, inclusive freedom calls on really a concerted effort by the campus community and its institutions to create the conditions whereby all members can speak up, not just nominally, but in effect, that they can really speak, that they will not be dismissed or undermined or silenced, particularly based on their identity. And the suggestion is really that if we fail to protect this second condition, right, the inclusive condition, then we are not only just hurting or harming some members of our community, which we are, but the other thing that we are doing is we are creating an impoverished conversation in which some viewpoints will not be heard in effect. So for us, what's important is for us as a university or college community, what is important is not simply just that we abide by the law and we make sure that, you know, we protect speech that is meant to be protected, but also really that we are able to hear what people are thinking and what they are experiencing and what their perspectives are, so that we can advance our knowledge in the way that we are intended to. So basically, we have here a similar weight that is given both to the protection of open expression and to the inclusion of all as members of this community of free inquiry.
Thank you. Greg and Jackie, I'm curious if you have thoughts about the tension between inclusion and freedom on college campus?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this one. So I think that it's a very complicated problem, but I think there's two big challenges to free expression on college campuses today. And the first one, I'm just going to build a little bit off Sigal's comments. Very many students do not think that the values of diversity and inclusion are compatible with free expression. And just to add a data point to this, the 2020 Knight Foundation Gallup survey found that 76% of undergraduates found that these that values are frequently or sometimes in conflict with one another. And students very often, when they think that there's this conflict, they're going to choose the side of diversity and inclusion rather than freedom of expression, because they sees these as core values to our American community in ways that are obvious to them in terms of addressing historical injustices. And I don't see how free expression, in fact, has been used to advance historically the interests of marginalized communities. So the kinds of work that Sigal is describing really speaks to this core challenge. You have to persuade students that diversity and inclusion are in fact complementary to freedom of expression. The second big challenge to freedom of expression today is the extreme dislike and distrust that a minority of students have for their political opposites. And I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm going to use a political science term, the effective polarization. And I think that the study that you've shared is terrific. Great kudos to you, the UNC researchers who brought out this survey. Really testifies to that being a problem. Students having divisive stereotypes, being unwilling to socialize with those who are their political opposites. 23% of self-identified liberals said they wouldn't have a conservative as a friend. And when they probed into that in one of the focus groups, a student said, well, I wouldn't have somebody in my support group who hates poor people. Well, that's a really divisive stereotype about conservatives that is an obstacle to public policy class, or even a science class where you're talking about public policy, and on the quad that gets in the way of freedom of expression. And so I think and that leads to the shutdowns and cancel culture that are some of the things that Greg has spoken about.
Greg?
Yeah, I definitely have sympathy, for the motives of talking about the tension between free speech and inclusion. But I have to say, for my actual experience, particularly when you start factoring things like class background, the higher I went in higher education from my actual background, the more it didn't seem tolerant at all. And a lot of the language that was talking about diversity and inclusion, a lot of times really equaled upper class ideas, upper class left-leaning ideas on how people should talk. And it wasn't super tolerant. It was very much, and that does plug in, of course, with my existing there's a joke that I make to my wife a lot, that essentially when I have a hard time taking orders, I'm like, well, it's a normal characteristic of those of us who do civil liberties laws. We have a built-in lack of eagerness to listen to authority. But I do think that in a lot of cases, the ideas that, like the codes that, for example, that come out of administrators claiming it's diversity and inclusion. One, they oftentimes look like the opinions of the ruling class, have to be enforced. You can see that sometimes in what we define microaggressions as. But also, the way they're actually used on campus is very telling. And so yes, absolutely, sometimes they are used against highly offensive speech. Overwhelmingly, though, I've seen universities use them against speech that simply the administrator or the president didn't like. I mean, the cases that get virtually no meaningful media coverage, but are kind of the big middle of fire cases, are people saying things that piss off the president of the university or piss off a low-level administrator, and they will refer to the speech code that they passed as like, but wait a second, didn't you say that was to make this place more tolerant, but you're using it to stifle what you see as a public relations problem? And to those of us who are First Amendment lawyers, this is an utterly predictable opinion. Restrictions on speech are always passed by people thinking they're saving the world, but time and time again, they end up getting used against minority rights or just in favor of power.
Well, so if I can have another word on that, I mean, and please just make a sign, Kevin, if I'm overdoing that, but I really agree with a lot of your descriptions. I agree with Jackie that students oftentimes perceive a tension, and part of the reason that they perceive a tension between open expression and inclusion or diversity or inclusion of diverse opinions and experiences and identities is because the open expression and free speech as a value has been oftentimes incorporated into a specific point of view that refuses to recognize the experience of those who carry a bigger burden of this. So let me just say as an example, of course, using racial slurs is a protected speech, generally speaking, with some caveats. And so people who are members of racial minorities who find this to be offensive when people use racial slurs are expected to basically, accept that this is how the law works and this is protected. Whereas in fact, the institution can take it upon itself, even if it doesn't, whether it's legally unable to, or it chooses not to silence or censor the use of slurs, it can still take further steps to carry some of the burdens away from the shoulders of those who have to otherwise carry it themselves. So students who live under conditions where, making fun of their group or rejecting their group in different ways, harassing their group just within the boundaries of the law is seen as permissible. So of course, as Jackie is saying, they will say, I don't like free speech. It's only just used to make my, friend or myself as a member of a minority group feel miserable. So we need to do part of what FIRE is doing and others are doing to educate students about the importance of free expression for the protection of minority opinions. I completely agree with that. And I think oftentimes our diversity and inclusion initiatives are actually doing what Greg is describing, which is just to say, look, you can say these things, you have to be nice, and you have to sign this contract that says that you're gonna be civil and you're gonna accept diversity. Of course, these are not good. So, of course, this is silencing and it's a form of censorship oftentimes. Of course, now is even worse because you're not even allowed to talk about that because critical race theory is no longer permissible by some legal interpretation of the recent executive orders. But, so we have a push and pull that is entirely politicized, right? And so our polarization is expressing itself also in our perspectives about open expression. I do hope that both people, who share Greg's views and people who share views like mine that are quite different on this really have a common ground here in hoping that students and other young people will learn to accept open expression as a really protective of minority groups and minority opinions when properly applied.
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about the need to aspire toward free speech on campus. So I'd like to draw our attention to some critics of the free speech model. And I'm curious if anyone got a chance to read Emily Bazelon's article in the New York Times Friday, where she questions the notion that more speech necessarily means freer speech. And she uses recent disinformation campaigns and the privatization of the news media as supports for that counterclaim. I'm curious what you think about that.
I'll jump in on that one, Kevin. So Emily Bazelon's, as you said, her argument is really about our broader civil society and does more speech, does more speech kind of ferret out the truth. And I just wanted to limit that to the campus situation. I mean, college campuses have a civic purpose in helping students evaluate arguments, evaluate evidence, and really hear the full range of give and take on on particular issues. And Greg is right in that it's very often speech that is is worthy of academic merit and discussion, and it is in the political mainstream that is silenced. I'll just give one example. At the University of Seattle Law School, the school withdrew its sponsorship or co-sponsorship with the Federalist Society of a debate on immigration. And the dean's statement, which I can't recall exactly, but it mentioned that it would cause anxiety and fear. If students heard a conservative view on immigration, well, that's just disabling law students from being who are going to be immigration lawyers, who may work for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or ICE, I guess now, who don't have the opportunity to really learn and think through those ideas. So when we limit speech and don't give students the opportunity to learn to critically assess arguments and figure out what is evidence, what's the claim, and stress test claims, from all points of view, we're really doing them a disservice. So I think rather than more regulation, or rather, and of course it's the case that more speech doesn't always lead to the truth. We need to make students better thinkers and better judges of the evidence that's in front of them, especially as we know that isn't done as well as it should be in K-12 schools.
I thought the Baseline piece was good. I have a lot of respect for both Emily and particularly Sister Laura, who's been a real hero of due process rights for accused students, even though it's a pretty unpopular position. I do think disinformation is a uniquely difficult problem, my last name is Russian, and I look very much to and the thing is, I was predicting that we were going to have this stuff coming out of Russia back in 2014, but now I can't say it without people thinking, oh, you're a conspiratorial Democrat. It's like, no, actually, this is going to be a fact of modern life, and we're going to have to figure out ways to address it. But I do get a little bit tired of watching this for decades and seeing everybody who wants to sound sophisticated saying, well, these days constitutional lawyers are rethinking free speech and think we're oversimple about it. And it's like, welcome to the club. That's been all of human history, where people think, oh, well, that's it. And what I try to point out is actually there is a lot of nuance in First Amendment law. It is actually surprisingly thoughtful, and there's greater troves of philosophy in there than usually get covered. So I definitely want to, because I don't really think the solution to beating disinformation is to allow the government to decide what's true. That's a terrible idea. And particularly given we're dealing with independent organizations that have freedom of association to begin with, the issues are frankly much more nuanced than just we need to rethink the First Amendment or free speech. So I'm going to work on a response here, but anything from Emily Baseline is going to be, thoughtful and interesting. So I did enjoy reading it.
Just a very quick response to this, Greg. I really hope that we all don't get tired of maybe not necessarily, we can each like whichever newspaper or magazine stories that we want, but I hope we don't get tired of rethinking and reinterpreting the First Amendment and the requirements of open expression, particularly on college campuses, but also more broadly, because I do think that these things are shifting and that on campus, each generation of students is going to teach us new ways to think about this, whether it's regarding, I don't know, transgender students, which were not on our radar a few decades ago in the same way that they are now. And so we got to think about things such as pronouns or name changes, and how does that impact sort of our understanding of open expression for people around them. And we have to be able to think about disruptions that you mentioned before. Shutting down, of course, is impermissible, but what kind of disruption might in fact be permissible in some cases where the event doesn't get shut down, right? Trying to draw lines that are appropriate for our campuses. So all of these things, and obviously platforms like social media platforms and other contexts, they requires for us to rethink how we evaluate permissible expression. The idea of going viral didn't exist up until 10 years ago. So the idea of anonymity, that I can actually say something and you will not know that it was I who said that, right? So if it's happening online and other guys. So all of these things require that we continue interpreting and thinking about it, and we should never get tired of it. It's also always really interesting to do. And I know it's interesting to you as well, because that's your life's work.
And I just want to add in there, this is where I actually will piss off some of my own lawyers at FIRE, is that I think of anonymity as kind of a seesaw. The more promise you have that you won't be punished for expressing your actual opinions, the less anonymity, the less important anonymity becomes. However, anonymity, when people want to defend anonymity, they point out Erdogan. They point out, the people who actually try to exercise their power, even beyond their borders, for example, Putin, for that matter, that the more likely you are to be punished, then the more the better argument you have for anonymity. And that's usually the way I think about it. But I do think that a lot of the issue with disinformation, if Twitter were to decide to take the action that essentially this has to be connected to to your Facebook account, that has to be verified in some way, I think that would really help us with the bots and a lot of the disinformation if that was actually policy. But does that undermine the potential for anonymity? Could that be offensive to transgender students? Could that create other problems? Of course it could. But at the same time, when you're picking one or the other, thinking about ways to defeat disinformation and the flooding of the market with falsehoods, yeah, I do think you have to try to get at what actually fix it.
Can I just jump in here too, and even bring it back, this kind of social media, to the campus context? Sigal, when I reread your book in advance of the event here, and one of the things that most struck me on the rereading was that you said at that time, and I'm wondering if you still have the same opinion, that social media or online speech isn't campus speech. And as we've seen, and especially now that so many campuses are virtual, more and more conversation amongst students does take place online and through social media. How do you see, is it now part of campus speech? And more broadly, how do we think about the social media part of enhancing and hindering campus expression?
Yeah, no, so you are completely right. I actually, not that it really matters, like I had a chapter on social media and it got dropped from the book. So basically what stayed was just this little snippet that said, well, the platforms are private, as Greg was saying. And so, and as you were saying as well, right? So they are private, as a campus administrator, if I can't, supervise Twitter. And so, and obviously I'm not expected to, and I shouldn't be supervising every person on campus's social media posts. It's both inadvisable and, just impossible. So in this sense, it's not campus speech, but I do think we need a more nuanced understanding of how social media and other forms of online expression is affecting campus relationship and campus standing and academic freedom. And there are all of these cases that FIRE are dealing with, where people are losing their jobs or otherwise being reprimanded for losing admissions to college for social media posts. And so I've written separately on this. This is my excuse, right? But you're right, it's not in the book.
Oh, and I feel like I need to make a quick pitch for the case that probably angers me more than anyone else this year. Professors are getting in trouble left and right for what they post on Twitter, and sometimes what they post is, you can kind of see it, but still it's protected, and they shouldn't get in trouble for it. But one of the most outrageous cases that I've seen this year that does not get enough attention was at Babson College in Massachusetts, where a professor, when Trump was saying that he would consider attacking historical sites and religious sites in Iran. He wouldn't have that off the table. The professor jokes that maybe we should send, Ayatollah Khomeini, which shows he knows he's joking. This is his area of expertise. Maybe we should send him list of places, cultural centers you could attack in the U.S. And the things he listed was, I don't know, maybe the Mall of America and the Kardashian residence. Obviously a joke. As soon as you're going to Kardashians, it's a joke. He was fired. He was fired, and he remains fired to this day. And it's so I know there are lots of hard cases out there, and they're at least hard in the sense like you have sympathy, for it. But really, check out a lot of the cases we're dealing with. It's amazing how rarely we're dealing with cases that are really like, oh, well, that's actually pretty nuanced. It's like, no, you shouldn't be firing someone for cracking a joke on Twitter.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're thinking about now in terms of online campus, and some campuses have put out statements about not statements, but just talk with their students about how the classroom is a kind of a semi-private space. It's not supposed to be, you can of course talk with your friends about what went on in class, but it's not supposed to be directly normally filmed or revealed on social media. And, as we're navigating this new time, we're finding, in the UNC study, the survey, it really testifies to that, a very high percentage of self-identified conservatives, but also liberals worried about their campus comments appearing in social media, and that chilled campus discourse and classroom conversation. And that was when classes were still, in person. So I think this leaking of social media into the classroom space is a real pernicious challenge for those of us who really want to keep, to think about how do you really foster the kind of conversations that we really want to have when college campuses are really living up to their highest ideals.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Jackie, because it is Research Week here at the University of North Carolina. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our study on our commitment to free speech. And one of the most disturbing things to come out of that, perhaps, is that one of the biggest obstacles we see is self-censorship. So I'm curious what you think we can do to combat students' need for self-censorship so that they feel comfortable sharing unpopular views in the classroom.
Well, I'm going to be interested in, I'm no longer regularly on a college campus like Sigal is, but look, this isn't something you can just say to people, don't self-censor. You have to model it and show it. And so that students, it's just an everyday thing for them to see ideas stress test in a college classroom. And the ones who are with the students the most are the faculty. And the study found that students said faculty are pretty good at respecting both sides in the classroom. But I think it's now more than ever, faculty have to be thinking about, what are three different ways in which, this is talked about in a public space, and bring them all into the conversation. In a STEM classroom, bringing public policy in it. And there's, so many other wonderful ways to do this. One I learned this summer from Libby Roderick, the Difficult Dialogues Initiative director at the University of Alaska. And she has this, what she calls the 5-minute rule. And at any point in a class, the professor or any student can say, well, I think this idea or this viewpoint isn't being heard, whether it's a religious viewpoint or conservative viewpoint or viewpoint of a marginalized community. And for the next 5 minutes, people can only offer ideas that advance the conversation from that perspective, whether or not it's their own. And I think we just need more ways as faculty, and there are other ways too, to show ideas being stress test and differences so that students think it's just something that happens every day of the week.
And that takes us, and Sigal, did you want to get in there?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think that the best way to combat self-censorship, which I think, is the second most worrisome thing in terms of, free speech on college campuses. The first one being legislation that is actually stifling speech. But the second one is self-censorship. And I think a key way to combat this, just as Jackie was saying, is really to support and expect faculty and instruct faculty into in how to have difficult conversations and how to advance viewpoint diversity in the classroom. And it's really something that has to be a part of the expectations of from teachers, whether they are regular faculty or otherwise.
So that takes us to another interesting question. As we talk about the need for ideological diversity, what is the tension between that goal and free speech itself?
Mm-hmm. What's the tension of having ideological diversity and freedom of speech?
Yes.
Well, the tension there is that in order to actually have a better balance of points of view, you might be in a situation where people could accuse you of doing a political litmus test, of essentially hiring people specifically for their ideology. But it's one of those things that's important to remember about the legal justification for example, race-based admission, affirmative action on campus, is one of the things that the Supreme Court found to be a legitimate motivation for that was to increase diversity of opinion, and in this case by proxy of race. Even though the other parts of that logic has been stripped off of the defense in later cases, including Gratt and Grutter in the Supreme Court, there's still this idea that if universities want to promote diversity of opinion, that they have a right to do that. I was always a little bit more iffy on the importance of diversity of opinion because, partially, I think a liberal-leaning professor can actually potentially do a good job of taking the point of view of a conservative. My opinion has changed on that somewhat, though, after writing my book with Jonathan Haidt, because just the numbers were really kind of shocking to me. That they've gotten so much worse than 3-to-1. They were 30-to-1 in some cases. And I know full well what happens in those cases is group polarization. That you end up in a situation where one, there's the hydraulic effect that essentially you just hear more arguments from your side, which is Cass Sunstein's theory. But then there's the tribalism that essentially kind of like there's an us versus them kind of mentality that if you don't have someone there who you think is smart and of good faith going, hey, wait a second, I completely disagree with you on that. So I think that universities, I think that the lack of it of viewpoint diversity has actually harmed the reputation of higher education, and I think it can potentially harm the production of ideas.
Yeah, I think there's no question that the lack of viewpoint diversity has harmed the reputation of higher education. So if you look at the Pew study from last summer about confidence in institutions, and 50%, I think, of about half of the country said that colleges and universities are having a negative effect on the way things are going in the country in these days. And 59% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents thought that. And it's clear that these concerns about viewpoint diversity, the big headline cases of conservatives being shut down, have fed that, and that's led to something that Sigal has pointed to of state legislators inserting themselves into college and university campuses through legislation that when that's really something for campuses to do themselves, and they truly know how to do it. So that loss of confidence has really hurt institutions, and institutions need to publicly be seen to be doing more about viewpoint diversity, not only to do it, but to be seen to be doing it to address this loss of public confidence. And some campus leaders are really trying to do that. Wesleyan President Michael Roth, not a conservative himself, just once again had a New York Times Sunday op-ed maybe 4 weeks ago, saying that, given the lack of conservatives on college campuses, you have to proactively bring that viewpoint onto campus. And, there are various ways to do that, but I think that's critical.
Oh, can I make a really quick pitch for a change of opinion I've also had on one thing? Listening programs. Whereas, my inclination is, this can all be solved with greater Oxford-style debates, which I actually would love there to be a larger number of Oxford-style debates because they're tremendously fun. But some of the best programs I've seen for cultivating empathy across lines of difference are very simple, and that you have someone who comes from, either coal mining Kentucky or from Ghana or from some other place where you don't know that much about, and simply have them sit down and explain to you where they're coming from without the intention of changing their mind. And I think that's also a very good thing to do from places that are supposed to be about knowing the world as it is, that have a scientific bent. So I've become much more pro listening programs, and I think campuses could really benefit from them.
And never a better time than today, when you don't actually have to fly somebody in. It's just a matter of getting an hour on their Zoom schedule. And I was talking with some students or a student, some students, and they said, well, isn't there just Zoom fatigue? And they insisted that if you have a really well-designed program, people are really, with lots of participation and thoughtful layout, their students are really want this kind of conversation. They're hungry for it.
Absolutely. And much cheaper honorariums for Zoom calls. Well, speaking of listening, I guess it's time to listen to some audience questions that we'll take now. Okay. So could someone speak about the speaker ban law, a historical case specific to UNC that points up the shifting dynamics between free speech, student activism, and institutional repression? Does anyone know about this?
Could someone remind me what the speaker ban actually says?
I'm not familiar with this either. Well, sorry.
I'll Google it.
Yeah, we'll look that up for you and try to get back to you, Brian. Thank you. Some of these questions we've just addressed, so I'm trying to go. Okay, here's a question from Jordan, specifically for Dr. Sigal. How else do you change the opinions of those who have offensive opinions, i.e. Fundamentalist Christians not believing in homosexuality, other than freedom of speech? If controversial ideas are not expressed, they cannot be solved. What would be your mechanism for change if not free speech?
Well, so actually, when I talked about inclusive freedom, the first value that I noted was the value of freedom of speech, right? So my first commitment is to freedom of speech. I'm just looking for additional ways to understand the burden that it creates and to help lift or share this burden, right? So obviously, I am very committed to protecting freedom of speech to the extent that, some people get very angry with me when I'm in an official capacity and I'm unwilling to censor views that they think must be silenced, such, offensive views but I will say that my goal, and that relates to Greg's comment about listening, my goal, I think, should, for the most part, not be persuasion, right? My goal, when I'm saying my goal, I'm really talking about myself, right? As a college professor, as an administrator, my role is not so much to change people's belief systems, right? Sometimes, as in the example that this person is giving, my goal can be to help them understand the impact of their words. It doesn't mean that they have to change their views, but maybe sometimes in a relational manner, they might choose to express themselves differently, right? But I do want to say that actually the protection of speech and the encouragement of further speech about controversial views can be helpful even beyond the boundaries of what is permissible. For example, later this month, I'm hosting Derek Black, who is a white supremacist, former white supremacist, who really wrote in the book, the book that was written about him, Rising from Hate, and is speaking quite widely about the ways in which conversation about his white nationalist, white supremacist views with peers on his college campus were a main motivator for him to think about whether these, Jewish kids who were having him over for Shabbat dinner, really probably didn't have horns, and maybe, so maybe his views, as an example, right, his views about various racial and religious minorities had to be rethought. And so obviously, I think open expression is a key to us knowing what people think and to us reconsidering our own views in light of others people's experiences or values. It's necessary. I just think that in some context, for example, in the classroom, as well as in some other campus contexts, we can have norms and we can have proactive measures to make sure that it's not always the same people who have to hear degrading ideas about their group again and again, because this really goes against their ability to speak.
Okay. Another person wanted to know your opinion on Harvard professor David Kane. I'm not familiar with this, but are you? Is anyone?
I am to a degree. He's accused of saying racist things on a private blog that include him being critical of race-based admission, for example. He also wanted to invite Charles Murray to speak there, and there was a article in the at Harvard in the Crimson saying that basically this guy has to go, and we're happy to defend him if he gets in trouble. We've reached out to him, and we stand ready to defend people with controversial points of view to stay as professors. And what's interesting is you got to remember kind of like compared to what when I looked at those numbers in terms of how much homogeneity there is among political belief on campus, the fact that we're still able to find people who need to be kicked off campus is remarkable by itself. So, I understand people's criticism of them. They have every right to criticize them. I wish the mentality would be to, first listen and then challenge once you understand where someone's actually coming from.
Okay. Sigal, again, another question I'm not familiar with, but Sigal, maybe you are, because this is a question about the Philadelphia statement. Is anyone familiar with this? No? Oh, Greg?
I don't have much more to say on it. I think it's pretty good. I didn't personally join it. My executive director joined it. Overall, I think it's a good statement. I preferred the Harper's statement, but then again, I'm a Democrat, so of course I do. But I think that people talking about these issues is overall positive.
And what is it exactly? What does the Philadelphia statement do? How does it distinguish itself?
I think it's mostly, unfortunately, I'm working from memory here. I think it's mostly about quote unquote cancel culture, a term that people don't really like, but immediately labeling your enemy as being, if the Southern Poverty Law Center has been critical of it, that means you cannot speak anymore. I think that's one of the things that they're concerned about, and how quickly we tend to label people as beyond the pale, which I think we particularly higher education should be better about.
So here's a question about cancel culture itself. The person wants to know, what exactly is cancel culture? I keep hearing this term and I'm not exactly sure what it is. So what is it exactly, and why is it an issue?
I'm happy to answer. The best answer ever has been provided by Jonathan Rauch, and I wrote, as with many things regarding free speech, nobody said it better than Rauch, and he gave 7 different characteristics. I wrote something on free speech in Carlin Romano, where I cover the 7 different characteristics that Rausch talks about. But for me, it's actually something much simpler. It's something I observed starting around 2014, and it's partially enabled by social media, where there was a sense of people who might have once just written angry letters to the New York Times saying, you gotta hire this person, are now have superpowers thanks to social media. And the thing that makes it pernicious is just this idea of like, oh, you know, one of the first ways it came to attention was Brendan Eich at Mozilla. He's religious, and he in 2008 had given $1,000 to an anti-gay marriage initiative. At the time, that was the overwhelming position of most Americans, and nominally including, you know, top politicians. And I was very happy to publicize the effort by about 65 gay rights superstars saying, no, this is not what we wanted. We didn't want people suddenly losing their job because they are on the other side of this fight. And I thought that was actually, you know, showing the best example of tolerance. So really, I think cancel culture is primarily where it bothers people is it's this going after an individual and making sure that that person that I really disagree with should not ever work again is what people mostly object to. But like I said, Rausch explains it in greater detail. And I have to say, I knew there were efforts prior to social media to like really go after this one particular person, but it has stepped up in such a way since 2014 that I wrote, actually it's my pinned thread on Twitter is all about. I know the term is controversial, but particularly when I've been worried about this since 2014, I'm just glad that people are paying more attention to it.
Jackie?
I mean, I think I would agree with what Greg has said, but I think cancel culture can exist when some people, and it doesn't have to be a majority, it can be but it's enough. Are willing to really socially shame and ostracize, like such that people will have like a big, you know, scarlet C on them for canceled. That they are really no longer credible members of the conversational community, and they're kind of cast out. And I think it's that fear of cancel culture is what is behind the self-censorship, that people don't know where the boundaries are. And they're worried that if they try out an idea, even tentatively, that they are going to be cast out as people who hold opinions or beliefs that are, you know, incompatible with social norms. And that fear is what drives so much of self-censorship.
So to play devil's advocate here, couldn't one say that this is just the public using their voice, using their free speech? If the public is offended by someone and they want to cancel a speaker and use their voice, whether it's as students or as consumers, to cancel them, isn't that their right to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. They are right to demand that someone be fired, but taken to its illogical extreme, you end up in a situation where nobody wants to, no dissenting opinion can have a job anymore. So basically, it's one of those things where you're arguing about old principles like to each his own, everyone's entitled to their opinion, all of these kind of norms that can help a pluralistic democracy hold together. And if we completely get rid of that and say you have to have the following points of view in order to be employed, that creates a real problem for the functioning of the whole enterprise. Sorry.
Right. No, I agree with you, but I also think, right, we have to make sure that, you know, the use of this term doesn't get extended or expanded beyond recognition, right? Because sometimes if you criticize a person, that's also impermissible. Oh, you're canceling me. I didn't cancel anyone. I was just responding to your views, and maybe I was responding strongly, and maybe I don't want to be your friend anymore because I think you have abhorrent values or views. That's not canceling, right? I do agree with I think you actually said it, or maybe it was in the spirit of your words, Greg, that, you know, getting a person to lose their job as sort of like the main goal, that's really, in the vast majority of cases, unreasonable as a response, even if someone acted in a way that's inappropriate or offensive There are other things to do, making a person lose their livelihood. Nobody's gonna hire them now, whether they are, selling pizza or they are a professor, it doesn't matter, right? Getting a person to lose their job as the main attribute of canceling them, that's, I think, maybe you can find a case where I would say, fine, that makes sense. But for the most part, and as a first step, before knowing anything, fire them, right? That's not a good plan.
Just to add on just a little bit, speech obviously shouldn't be consequence free. I can say something that will wound a friend such that's the end of the friendship. But especially with undergraduates, we want to lower the consequences, as much as possible. Like, I don't think, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think, I and many other people would not really want to, be held to all the things that we said when we were 18 years old. And, people should have lots of wide scope to try out ideas and then later reject them, or, and we should make that process as, we should make it not scary to try out something that's even very provocative.
It's interesting because in a weird way, it is free speech, but it can also create an unsafe environment for these speakers that are being canceled. In a way, it connects back to your point, Sigal, about inclusive freedom, and how sometimes when we allow a space for these provocateurs to come in, it can facilitate an unsafe space for underrepresented communities on campus.
Right, but that doesn't mean that they should never be invited, right? I mean, it's always a balancing act, right? In the same way that there are forms of speech that are not acceptable. I mean, even Jackie started us off by saying, plagiarism is protected speech, right? It is protected. Lying is protected in the public sphere. Can you imagine, right? But if you are plagiarizing, or if you are falsifying your data as a researcher, it might be protected, but you can still reasonably be punished for that, or even lose your job, depending, right? So, the point being that there are ways in which we operate on a college campus that go well beyond what the law requires. And if there is a speaker who I think, I don't think the geography department has to be required to invite a representative of the Flat Earth Society, right? I mean, even if it's protected speech, we have to be able to discern what is appropriate for our mission and our goals. And the speakers don't have a right to appear on my campus, right? I can discern, as I think all of us agreed, the institution can discern whether it's a department or, depending on the circumstances, who it is that is appropriate for our campus to listen to. And I would hope, again, along with the others, and along with Michael Roth from Wesleyan, that it would be a very broad range of views that would be supported by the institution.
Thank you. Well, we have time for just one more question. And while we do that, I want to just warn viewers that they're about to see that 2-question survey pop up. So feel free to answer those questions. But as they do that, I want to ask each of you, not necessarily what is the most important thing schools can do, but specifically, what is the first step? What is the next step that students in particular should take to promote and protect free speech on campus?
Well, I'll start us off. I think students should somehow organize, and they're very good about doing these things, and have a poll post-election about the 5 most important issues that are facing the country post-election. And, as we've said, bring in somebody on Zoom is super easy, and have 5 expert panels on, with various viewpoints, paired with, in each case, a second student discussion debate informed by what they've learned from a wide range of experts. So I think that kind of knowledge-informed student debate on 5 top issues post-election.
I mean, if we want to do what students should do, because there are things that institutions should do, but students should figure out ways to collaborate and exchange opinions with groups on campus that they find to be most disagreeable. So they should figure out a way, given that these views exist in society, and they should figure out a way to understand them, to sympathize, or even to argue against them. They should find a way to touch base and to have a relationship, even in a, in a more limited way, with clubs or groups that they find to be unappealing.
I wish I could keep it to just one, but I recommended 5 different things. Actually, I've moved up to 6 different things in my latest recommendation on what alumni can do to protect free speech on campus. But the simplest and most direct is, defend your fellow students, defend your professors. So like if they're going to fire someone for like a tweet, for example, be the one coming out first saying, well, I disagree with this person. I don't think they should be fired. And I'm going to add a second one. I do think that universities would really benefit by having good, thoughtful, philosophical discussions of inquiry and academic freedom, of the depth of the project of human knowledge that people are being invited into on the very first day they get on campus. So so those are really kind of my 2 wishes, but I have so many more.
Well, I want to thank you all for a very robust and insightful discussion. You all were great. I learned so much. I'm sure our viewers did as well. I want to thank Dean Rhodes for her introduction and for supporting this type of programming. We also want to thank the UNC Institute of Politics for co-sponsoring this event for us. Most importantly, we want to thank everyone who watched our discussion tonight and remind you that you can find a link to view this on our YouTube page in a few days. Have a great evening and keep the discussion going. Thank you.
Thank you.